So let me introduce you to Becky, and most of you can probably see her on your screen now. She is the former founder and president of Human Resources Plus. Before founding HRP, Becky served as the vice president of HR for Cordillera. Is that how you say it, Becky? Cordillera.
Cordillera.
Oh, Cordia.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
A 7,000-acre premier golf community in Vail, Colorado. Wow, with over 60 employees. Becky joined JER HR Group as Director of HR Services in 2023, and she is widely recognized as an expert in strategic HR management, benefits administration, finance, and state and federal employment laws. And we will be sending you credits if you stay on. Remember, you have to stay on for at least 60 minutes in order to get your credits. We have SHRM credit for you as well as HRCI credit. So be sure and stay on for that. And Becky, will they receive a PowerPoint today?
It will be within 2 days,
Within two
two
days.
business days.
2 business days. Very good.
Yep.
Okay. So, yeah, that's great to know because everybody loves your webinars, and that's great information that you're going to share with us. So, we hope that you will enjoy today's webinar and stay on after the webinar for a short survey that both Sherman and HRCI like for us to do. So, if you'll just take a few minutes and answer 2 or 3 questions for us, we would appreciate it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Becky for today's webinar.
Thank you, Cynthia. Cynthia. Oh, starting off really good here. 55 minutes with me. Anyway, good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Especially depending on where you're from. Welcome and thank you so much for your attendance. Just a quick reminder, I know it was on the original housekeeping screen, but this is just general information. It's not legal advice. State and local laws may have stricter requirements, so always kind of review what's in your specific area. Also, I just want to give you a heads up that you may hear a few pauses, and that's me taking a drink of water because I will be taking my camera off during the entire presentation. Also, at the end, like Cynthia mentioned, we'll have a question and answer section, and it's going to be, about material we covered today or general best practices. But I want everybody to kind of understand that we're not able to really address specific workplace situations or provide guidance on individual investigations during this session. As everybody knows, every situation involves unique facts and legal considerations. So we'll try to answer the questions as best as we can. If we don't get to your question, I want to give you my email. Please reach out to my email is Becky, that's common spelling, BECKY, at jerhrgroup.com. So also we have the info on there if you misplace my email. Before I start this presentation, I want to share a quick personal story. Over 20 years ago, when I was in an HR leadership position, my team and I were involved in an investigation that was national news. And almost every step we took was scrutinized and questioned publicly. Just imagine that for a moment. For me personally, it taught me a lot of things, but most importantly, that a structured and repeatable framework is vital. And as they say never, so just be prepared. We're going to talk real quick about the agenda. We're going to talk about recognizing when an investigation is needed, how to plan and conduct an effective investigation, evaluate information and research findings, close an investigation appropriately, prevent retaliation and monitor post-closure, and then we'll have our Q&A. So now I'm going to turn off my video and we're going to dive into the presentation. So the first slide we're going to talk about is recognizing when an investigation is needed. So there's common triggers, obviously harassment and discrimination allegations, retaliation complaints, policy violations, code of conduct, ethics, safety concerns, theft or fraud, bullying or hostile work environment, whistleblower complaints. And as many of you know, not every situation comes with those big flashing warning lights. We're often having to evaluate shades of gray and deciding when a reasonable review is needed to protect either the employees or the organization. Also, I want to point out discrimination issues are a great example of why you have to pay attention to state and even local laws. For instance, about 27 states now specifically protect hair texture and hairstyles. In addition, Colorado and New York currently have a different definition of what constitutes hostile work environment. Another important point is that investigations don't only start when someone uses legal language or says the word harassment. Sometimes the trigger is just simply an employee saying they feel uncomfortable, unsafe, or treated unfairly. Lastly, I just want to mention the retaliation portion. It continues to be the most commonly filed EEOC charge year after year. So anytime you're considering an adverse action, and adverse action is, termination, write-ups, things like that, you want to make sure it's well documented, consistent, and defensible. Now we're going to move on to what we call the notice standard. So some examples of the notice standard is casual comments, anonymous reports, exit interviews, someone making a statement, I don't want to make this a big deal. And then when a formal investigation may not be required, and I, stress may because of the, other states that have a little bit broader definition of hostile, routine performance coaching, minor misunderstandings, immediate correction with documentation. A standard that everyone should know is once leadership knows or should have known, you must act. So and then we're going to kind of go into that, but it's really important that on the should have known. Even informal complaints trigger responsibility. So here comes the tricky part. Gossip and rumors are unfortunately part of our work life. And although you don't have to investigate every time you hear something, but you want to make sure that you become aware of information that reasonably suggests any of the triggers we've discussed, you can't ignore it. So here are some things to think about. Was the rumor specific? Does it suggest ongoing conduct? Or is there a potential risk to employees or the organization? If the answer is yes to any of those, at a minimum, you need to conduct a preliminary review, which might mean doing some discrete fact finding, documenting what you heard, and assessing maybe whether a formal investigation is warranted. Ignoring it entirely is where the risk shows up. And at the end of the webinar, I'm going to show you some EEOC claims where this occurred. So not every rumor requires a full-blown investigation, but credible information about potential discrimination always requires a response, and make sure to document your reasoning. In my situation, and this is maybe why I'm so passionate about it, that I mentioned at the beginning, it started as a rumor. And I'll be completely honest, the first thing in my head when I heard this rumor was, that's so unbelievable, there's no way it's true. However, something in my gut didn't sit right. It supposedly came from an employee I'd known for a long time, and I knew this employee was not known to be dramatic or to be consistently involved in gossip or rumors. With just a few questions, we knew we had a serious situation on our hands. And now we're going to move on to our first interactive poll. And the question is, what is the single biggest challenge you face when conducting workforce investigations? Getting witnesses to speak openly, time pressure, tight deadlines, maintaining confidentiality, deciding an appropriate corrective action, or document everything thoroughly. And we'll give you a second to answer. All right. Do you think we're good, Sanchitha, to be able to publish?
I'm going to give like few more seconds.
Okay, great.
End the poll now and display the results.
Awesome. What I love about this poll is you'll see that it shows investigations are just multi-layered. It's just not one skill. So the more structure you build in your process, including training, the less overwhelming each of these pieces become. For A, this is very common, and we're going to talk about how setting expectations at the beginning in an interview can kind of assist in building trust. Time pressure, you know you have to move quickly, but rushing can create errors, so you want to be careful. Maintaining confidentiality is a tough balance. You just need to try to protect privacy as much as possible and conduct a fair investigation. Deciding an appropriate corrective action. This is very common, and we'll kind of talk about it more in detail. And then documenting everything thoroughly. This is definitely overwhelming. I get it. I actually did an investigation once that I had 11 witnesses. I didn't want 11 witnesses, but they all came forward and it was completely overwhelming. And the spreadsheet and documents were amazing, but I totally get that. So I love that there's a variety of answers and it just shows that there's, multi layers to it and more than one skill. So thank you, Sanchitha. And now we're going to move on to plan and conduct an effective investigation. Now let's talk about assigning the right investigator, as this is really where things can go wrong if we're not careful. They need to be neutral and unbiased. And I know that sounds obvious, but it's worth really slowing down and really thinking it through. Does this person have any stake in the outcome? Are they emotionally connected to the situation? Do they have a known relationship with either party outside of work? Typically, the investigator is someone in HR or senior leadership, but there are situations where that doesn't work if they are the alleged accused. So obviously, they can't be the ones conducting the investigation. So the goal is to assign someone who can be truly objective. Second, you want to make sure that there's no reporting relationship. If the investigator supervises either party or sits in a leadership chain, that's going to be a red flag. Even if they can be objective, they won't feel that way to others. So remember, you guys, perception matters as much as the final decision. The third bullet is trained interviewer. This is really important. As we did in the poll, and this kind of reiterates the poll, handling an investigation is a skill and training is vital. So just some of the skills that they may need is asking how to ask open-ended questions, avoid leading questions, staying neutral in tone and body language, understanding silence can work for them, be able to ask follow-up questions. I've always felt like those were the toughest when I did it. Separate facts from assumptions. There's many options for training. We're just going to mention a few. Of course, you can do a formal course training. You can do role playing, provide them with structured question templates. So just remember when you're training, everyone has different learning styles. The next thing we're going to talk about is a company representative trained on confidentiality, and we refer to this as a company witness. So we recommend having a company witness present during interviews whenever possible. And typically it's someone from HR or a neutral member of management. And this really helps with preventing he said, she said situations about what occurred during the interview itself. So the witness shouldn't have any involvement in the matter, no reporting relationship, and obviously no personal stake. Their role is not to participate in the questioning, but just to observe and take notes if needed. It adds credibility to the process and protects both the organization and the investigator if the interview is later challenged. And lastly, keep in mind, sometimes you may have to consider an outside investigator if the senior leadership is involved or you're a small company. Employees aren't just looking for an outcome, they want to feel the process was fair. And now we're going to move on to creating an investigation plan before starting. So before we start interviewing anyone, you need to gather information and create a plan. First, what policy is involved? Go back to your employee handbook. What policy applies here? Is there harassment, workplace conduct, safety? Then what are the specific allegations? Who did what, to whom, when, and were there witnesses? Again, a standardized, and I know I'm going to drive this home 1,000 times, but again, a standardized template can help in the process. Also, on a side note, if you just have one employee, we strongly recommend that all employers have an up-to-date employee handbook. A compliant handbook is a must in this day and age. I just can't stress that enough. Now, third, we're going to talk about who needs to be interviewed: a complainant, a witness, and the accused. This process, if anybody's been through this, is stressful for everyone. So although it may be necessary to follow up with some interviewees, try to keep it at a minimum. And that's why I said that for me, the follow-up questions were the hardest, because I never wanted to go back and have a follow-up interview with any of them. So on the fourth, what documents are relevant? So examples of documents are emails, text messages. Don't forget about Teams and Slack messages, performance reviews, time records, security footage, all of that. And finally, the timeline. Investigation should start as soon as possible. You don't want to rush them, but you want to be prompt, because it sends, says you're taking it seriously. And one thing we see, which is just will move your investigation off the rails, is once you start, don't drag it on, because that's going to be a big trust killer. All right, now we're going to move on to interview best practices. So now we're going to discuss and kind of focus on the interview itself. I'm going to walk you just through a sample structure of how an interview might be handled, so you have something practical to follow. But keep in mind, this isn't a one-size-fits-all. Your legal counsel or outside investigator may structure things a little differently depending on the situation. The goal here isn't to give you a script carved in stone, but kind of give you a solid framework that you can use confidently. Before you ask a single question, you need to set a tone. You want to lower the anxiety, establish professionalism, show respect, and signal structure. You should briefly thank them for their time and then immediately move into the purpose of the meeting. So you're going to strive to open every single investigation interview the same way. Consistency builds the credibility. I suggest, generally using 4 things. First, explain the purpose. Something simple like, we're conducting a workplace review related to a concern that's been raised. Notice I didn't say complaint against you. I didn't say investigation into a misconduct. I kept it neutral. Second, confidentiality, and this one's important. On my interview template, I actually copy the text of the exact text from our employee handbook on confidentiality and read that. In general, you want to know, you'll strive to keep it as confidential as possible, but we all know employees talk, so you never, ever, ever want to promise full confidentiality. Third is to reinforce anti-retaliation. Again, I have a copy of the exact text from our employee handbook on retaliation. You want to let them know that it's prohibited, and if they have any concerns, to contact you immediately. And the fourth is expectation of honesty. So we expect you to complete and truthful information. Now let's talk about during. This is where discipline matters. You want to start broad, tell me what happened, walk me through that day, when did this begin, let them talk. Then you narrow it down. Who was there? What exactly was said? Where were you standing? How often did this happen? When you run into situations where their statement is general, such as, my boss is hostile to me, Ask something like, help me understand what specifically was said or done. Then we're going to talk about a neutral tone, and we've kind of talked about this, and we know it sounds simple, but you want to also think about body language. Don't raise your eyebrows, sigh, or say things like, really? That surprises me. Even subtle reactions can influence when someone says next. Your job is not to agree. Your job is not to disagree. Your job is to gather information. And sometimes silence is your best tool. If someone pauses, let them think. Again, think about training interviewers so they are prepared. These situations are never easy. Now we're going to talk about what to avoid. Just real quick, never promise outcomes. We'll take care of this. And second, you want to avoid leading questions. So he yelled at you, right? You want to say, how would you describe the tone? So leading questions can lead to bias and, kind of weaken your documentation later, which your documentation is obviously a very important part of it. So I kind of want to expand on bias. I thought this would be a good opportunity at this point to talk about this. A lot of people in HR on this, attendees on this webinar, recognize that there's biases that we coach our managers in recruiting, and they could show up in investigations. So I just want to kind of circle back and review a few of these biases. So we have the first one that's called halo effect. And that may be you have a high performing leader, everybody loves her, she's been there 15 years. You hear an allegation, and your first thought is that doesn't sound like her. That's a halo effect. And then you have a horn effect, which is the opposite, where you have someone who's had performance issues or conflict, and you think, well, that tracks. That's the horn effect. So past issues don't automatically mean current guilt. And then you have confirmation bias. And this one is you interview the complainant first, and then you think, okay, I know what happened here. And then every interview after that, you kind of subconsciously are looking for that confirmation. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is, it's called an affinity bias. And maybe someone, communicates like you, thinks like you, has a similar personality. You feel comfortable with them. Comfort doesn't equal credibility. So there's many biases, and it may be a good idea to have a refresher. Before we move on, I want to address the question of whether interviews in the workplace investigation should be recorded. This is not a one-size-fits-all answer, but in most internal investigations, recording is generally not recommended. One reason is that recording can make people less comfortable and less willing to speak openly, especially witnesses who may already feel nervous about participating. It really can change the tone of a fact-finding conversation to something that feels less than formal. So, and another consideration, obviously, is the legal compliance. So if you have any questions about recordings, you need to, for sure, seek advice from your legal counsel before you do anything like that. All right, now we're going to move on to document standards. So on the document standards, you want to write facts, not opinions. You want to use direct quotes when helpful. You want to date every note, and you want to secure files from personnel files. And one thing I probably should have put in the bullet is you do want to kind of strive to get written, signed, and dated witness and interview statements if possible. But when you document interviews, you want to make sure you keep emotions out of it. It's not I feel, I think. It's kind of like when you're doing performance improvement plans, just the same tracks along with the same thing. You just want to write what was said, not your interpretation. So if you say Pat was invasive, you really want to write Pat paused for approximately 20 seconds and said, I don't recall that. Instead of writing, well, Pat was rude during the meeting, use Pat raised his voice and stated this is ridiculous. Instead of Pat being angry, use Pat stood up, spoke loudly, and stated, I am not down with this conversation, something like that. So Facts protect you, opinions create exposure. So at the end of the day, your role in the investigation interview is not to prove someone right or wrong. I know I've mentioned it several times, but it's to gather complete factual information in a structured, neutral way so the organization can make a defensible decision. This will help to dramatically reduce risk and increase the trust that your employees have. So it's kind of the four-pronged thing: open with clarity, ask disciplined questions, guard against bias, and document objectively. Keeping investigation records in a confidential file separate from personnel files, obviously with a limited, strict, and need-to-know basis. Really depends on your organization as far as, what your records are. Or do you have a secure HR drive, a case system, or a locked file cabinet? Also, as far as retention requirements vary, but generally you should follow your document retention policy or any applicable legal requirements, and definitely err on the side of retaining them long time. So I'm going to take a drink of water, but before we go to the next part of our webinar, I'm going to pause for a quick second, and I'm going to ask Christy if she sees any questions that we can address right now at this time. And Christy is one of our senior HR consultants.
Hey all, I'm Christy. All right, Becky, there were a few questions. The first was, at what point do you involve an attorney in a workplace investigation?
Oh, great question. So generally, and of course, generally, it's going to be when it's significant. So you have allegations that involve senior leadership. It's a protected class. The EEOC is what overlooks the protected classes. Or maybe someone who says, I'm going to sue. But having said that, it also depends on your organization practices regarding legal involvement on when to contact them. So once again, I kind of go back to a plan. As an organization, you should probably have a conversation to determine at what point when these things come up with your legal counsel. Some legal counsel may say, I want to be notified every time. Some of them may say these are the parameters. So make sure you have that discussion with your legal counsel so you know. And let's take one more before we get back with the road show.
All right, the second one that I saw in the chat is, how do you find out if an interviewer may be biased?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, we're dealing with people, so there's just no way. There's no way for you to know 100%, right, of their bias. But I kind of look at it when you're looking at an interviewer. Do they have prior employment involvement? Do they have like strong perceived opinions that they've already expressed? So really that's where the training comes in, that it's so important, because trained interviewers, actually they train you to recognize your own bias. So I think that training is really vital. So it's not a 100%, but there are things you can look for and things that you can kind of protect yourself on. So thank you everybody for your questions. I know we have several more, but we got a lot of content to cover, and I want to make sure that we cover it all.
Becky, do you mind if we just get to one other, and this is, I think, an easy one. They asked if you would repeat what you said about being neutral on the purpose of the meeting. I think they wanted to take the note down on what you stated because they liked the phrase, but they didn't catch it for their notes.
Ooh, which one would that be? Neutral.
And if you don't have it handy, we can always send it out
Yeah.
after.
Yeah, we'll send it. We'll definitely
Okay.
send it. We'll make sure we respond to everybody in the chat. Because I know that, the more information you have, the more it'll help you as these things occur, and hopefully don't occur. But anyway, so thank you, Christy. All right, we're going to move on to evaluate and reach findings. Okay, this is where leaders often feel the most pressure. I know I do, because a decision has to be made. You have to make it. So, and, I want to kind of start by reframing something important. The goal of the investigation is not to prove guilt. Okay, we're not prosecutors, we're not in a courtroom. The goal is to determine whether, a company policy was violated based on the information available to us. So when we get to evaluating the information and reaching findings in the employment investigation world, we apply what's called the preponderance of the evidence standard. So in simple terms, it means more likely than not, 51%. So not beyond a reasonable doubt, not 100% certainty. Sometimes leaders hesitate because they're waiting for, the smoking gun, a written confession, absolute proof. And for people on here that's been in HR for a long time, those rarely come along. It's always in that gray area. So in reality, we're having to make decisions on whether or not it's more likely than not that the conduct occurred. So how do we get comfortable with applying that standard? So we're going to evaluate credibility doing objective factors. So for consistency, is the story consistent over time? Do the details remain the same through interviews? Is there cooperation? Obviously the documentation, the witness, anything that kind of supports or contradicts the statement. The third is plausibility. Does the account logically make sense within the context of the workplace? And then fourth, motive. Is there any reason someone may exaggerate or minimize? And that doesn't automatically discredit someone, but it's going to be part of your analysis. And then I put this last one on here, and part of me is like, I wish I would have removed it. I don't know, but you can consider demeanor, but I say it really, really carefully because it should not be overweighted. Someone can be emotional, doesn't mean that they are truthful. Doesn't mean they're not truthful. Someone being calm doesn't mean that they're credible. So you really have to be disciplined in that area. So the main thing is we want to avoid this he said, she said. If you end your report with there's conflicting accounts and we cannot determine what happened without explaining why, you just haven't completed the credibility assessment. So even when it gets to the point where there's conflicting stories, you still have to evaluate consistency, the corroboration, the plausibility, and the motive. And sometimes the result is still inconclusive, but at least you've gone through the process and the analysis. So you've done that part of the process. All right, we're going to move on to possible findings. So we have substantiated. So we'll start with the findings. So this is kind of where everything all comes together. So substantiated means the evidence supports that the conduct more likely than not occurred. In other words, based on the information available, it is reasonable to conclude the allegation is supported. Unsubstantiated, means the evidence doesn't support that the conduct occurred. So that doesn't mean it didn't necessarily happen. It's just that there wasn't sufficient reliable evidence to confirm it. Inconclusive means there's not enough evidence to determine either way. So this happens, there's conflicting accounts or there's just no corroborating information. So it's important not to force a decision if you just don't have any evidence at all. And then we move into the policy found and the policy violation not found. So sometimes it doesn't rise to the level of a policy, and sometimes it has. So you want to use your handbook language, but once again, back to the handbook, whenever possible, and tie your findings directly to the relevant policy. That alignment is what makes the decision defensible and, demonstrates that you've established standards, just not a personal judgment. And clear findings also help leadership understand the rationale for any corrective behavior and provide consistency if similar issues arise in the future. And now we're going to move on to the next slide. First, gather facts, then determine corrective action. So here comes the corrective action. This is where the leadership courage shows up. So corrective action must be consistent, proportionate, aligned with the policy, and documented. So it's really crucial that you're consistent. If you've handled just like in any performance issue, if you've handled similar situations in the past with coaching and you need a reason, this time it's going to be termination, that's not consistency. And it needs to be proportionate, with the severity. So not every policy violation means termination. That, not every violation can be solved with a conversation either. So policy aligned means your employee handbook should support your decision, and documentation, make sure you clearly recorded what happened, why, and why you took it. Other considerations that we have on here is severity, prior history, whether the individual holds a leadership role, and the broader workplace impact. And one thing is leaders often are getting held to, and I'll put it quote unquote, higher standard because of their influence. The EEOC looks at leaders, so however that is determined in, managers, supervisors, people in leadership roles that have control over staff. They should reflect the policies of the company so that, they can tend to have a little bit higher standard there. Even if conduct doesn't rise to the level of some sort of, unlawful harassment, it can still violate your standards of conduct or professionalism. So the main thing is you just can't, you have to act, because failing to act's it's just gonna make things much worse. So, I was personally in a situation where it was an extremely high performer that brought in a lot of money. It, it was going to cause a lot of disruption. And, unfortunately, we couldn't worry about that because there was a clear violation and we had to take the adverse action that we took. So you don't want to hesitate because you're worried about upsetting a high performer or creating a disruption. So employees want to, see that their concerns were substantiated and everybody was treated fairly. So at the end of this phase, you really should be able to say clearly and calmly kind of what happened, what evidence, why you reached it. And, you really have to just be disciplined and objective and have some confidence. Then, just apply the standard policy and evaluate everything that you have, been able to ascertain during the process. All righty. Now we're going to go to our second and final poll question. And so an employee reports, I think my manager is bullying me. What do you do first? Immediately start reviewing the manager, ask the employee for specific examples and witnesses, check if they've already tried to resolve it informally, pull HR policies and document the complaint, escalate to legal and compliance right away.
I'm going to wait for a few more seconds. Some interesting answers. I think it's the highest I've ever got for a single option. Okay, I'm ending the poll now and I'm going to share the results.
Great. Everybody knows what to do. So, yep, the starting point is asking the employee for specific examples. So, when someone says, I think my manager is bullying me, that's not facts. You just, once again, let me understand exactly what happened, what was said, what was done, because those details are going to matter. And what it'll do is help you determine, are you looking at a communication issue? Are you looking at a performance issue? Was, something just, unprofessionally delivered poorly, or something that really does rise to a serious policy violation. So great job, everybody. All right. Now we're going to move on. And I'm looking at timing here, and I'm wondering if we should come back to this. Let me decide here. Well, we'll just go through this really quick because I thought it'd be great to do an example, but I just don't want to run out of time. So I'm going to do this real high level. So, because this is so many times of what we actually have, Sarah reports to her manager, Tom creates a hostile work environment. She says he talks down to her in meetings, interrupts her, and once said, you need to toughen up, if you want to succeed here. And she says it feels targeted and demeaning. So before I walk through this example, I want to emphasize that this is just a high-level illustration to demonstrate how you may evaluate information. It's not a step-by-step guide on how to conduct the investigation. For the sake of time, I just wanted to include an example that a lot of us, kind of come upon during our work careers. So we're just going to talk about that a little bit. So at first glance, you kind of look at it, he's like, well, maybe he's just a tough manager, you know, uh, we need to know, as we said, the last question is what happened? Who else was president or present? How did it happen to others? Those kind of things. So when you're speaking to Sarah, you want to drill down onto those questions to get some specifics. Let's say in the scenario, she doesn't, when you ask her, she doesn't allege discrimination. She doesn't reference a protected class. There's no slurs, inappropriate jokes, or obvious policy language that jumps out. It's just behavior that feels uncomfortable and unprofessional. But she did clearly use the word hostile. So I would investigate. So you meet with her first, and she says the three meetings with, was Tom interrupted her. She talked about the comment he was toughening up. She becomes emotional. And then next you talk to the team members, and one says, well, that's Tom. He's just direct, or talk to the witnesses that were there. And then another one says, well, he can be blunt, but I've never seen him single her out. So that comment may be important because it suggests the behavior may be broad rather than targeted. Then you interview Tom and he acknowledges, like, yeah, I told her to toughen up, but he says it's performance coaching and he explains it. He interrupts everybody because meetings run long and he completely denies targeting Sarah. So when talking to Tom, you want to once again get the additional email and then you just or get the additional information and then you go to look for documentation. There's no emails, there's no text, there's no written documentation. So you just have Sarah, the witnesses, and Tom. So this is where it comes in is you apply the preponderance standard, more than likely or not. Is it more likely than not that Tom violated the harassment policy? Probably not. But because there's evidence tying the conduct, there isn't any evidence tying to protected class. But it doesn't mean there's no issue. And then you look at the credibility. Sarah's examples are very specific and they're consistent. The witnesses, agreed with that pretty much. And Tom admitted to the comment. So, and they said, yep, he can be blunt. So while it's not unlawful harassment, there is still a workplace conduct issue. And remember, we talked about Tom as a manager, so there's a little bit of an elevated risk there. So you may conclude that there's not a harassment policy violated, but the behavior does conflict with professionalism and respectful workplace expectations. So, you'll want to circle back, talk to Sarah, and, the key takeaway is, you want to talk to Tom. There could be, retraining that has to be done. He has to, meet with his boss to clarify expectations moving forward and also kind of outline consequences for him if his expectations aren't met. So the key takeaway is that not every investigation kind of ends in this dramatic finding. Sometimes the outcome is just a course correction and not really punishment. And, it's still a successful investigation because the goal is to apply the policy fairly, protect employees, and address the risk. So the main thing is don't use that, and we hear it a lot, that's just so-and-so's personality. If there's been a complaint, you really, really probably need to investigate. All right. We're going to move on. Thank you. I had a drink of water there. To closing an investigation appropriately. We have 2 slides on this. So the first one is that, the thing is closing is probably one of the most important aspects. They're all important, but think about this. The employees don't see your notes. They don't see what you've gone through. They don't know the policy analytics. They just haven't, they don't understand all that. So what they experience is how you close it. So if it's kind of dismissed or really vague, they're not going to feel like it was handled appropriately. So the first thing you want to do is communicate with the complainant. And when you meet with them, the message should be structured and calm. So, you just let them know that the investigation's been complete. You confirm that the appropriate action has been taken based on the findings. And then, you make sure you let them know, obviously, they can't share confidential, details on on discipline matters. So you can't tell them what discipline occurred and, you can't disclose corrective measures. I always felt like that was the hardest part, in investigation is not being able to share that information, but it's very, very important you don't. So you can say, we reviewed the information thoroughly and have taken appropriate action consistent with our policies. So that phrase kind of kind of makes you, kind of protects confidentiality, but really does reinforce the seriousness of it. And always, always, always let them know about retaliation and to have them report to you immediately. To me, that's it, immediately, because I've been in situations where, they come to us a couple weeks later. So they need to make sure that if there's something that they feel isn't correct, they need to come to it. So communicating with the accused, that's where we're at. Now, you're going to be a little more direct in this one, and you're going to explain the findings clearly. So if there's no policy violation, you say so. If there was a policy violation, you state it clearly, and then really important, outline the expectations moving forward. If there's going to be consequences like coaching, suspension, whatever, those need to be communicated directly and documented. And then in every situation where there's no violation found, you still want to, clarify and say, while we didn't find a violation of policy, we expect all our leaders to communicate professionally and respectfully. So just try to be professional calm, and factual. And then we're going to move on real quickly to closing an investigation. So you have the allegation summary, you have the evidence reviewed, you got your credibility assessment, you've got your findings, whether there was any corrective action taken. You've communicated appropriately and you've documented. When you close it and it's handled with structure and professionalism, employees really do notice, and it really helps build the trust overall and move on from the situation. So that's our goal. I'm not going to spend too much time on this portion because we kind of talked about it in our document standards, but I just want to reiterate, maintain a separate file and investigation file, follow the retention policy, and consider litigation hold if needed. And actually, I'm going to jump to the retention policy because we're kind of getting closer on time here and I don't want to miss it. So in terms of timing, just to let you know, an employee can file either with the state or the EEOC, and under federal law, it's 180 days. But some states, the time frame extends up to 300 days. So, and in California and New York, in some situations, it can be up to 3 years. So, as I said prior, just I would hold it on forever for quite some time. But if we have enough time, I'll kind of expand on that as we get to the end. All right, next, I think we're at prevent retaliation and monitor foreclosure. So this is big. Examples are unexplained schedule changes, exclusion from meetings, sudden negative reviews, subtle hostility. It can be very subtle. So you got to remember, managers may be very nervous after something happened and they don't even realize they're interacting, a certain way. So you want to really make sure that you kind of re-educate them on that. Also, one part that a lot of organizations missed is the proactive monitoring, which is the 30 or 60-day check-in in the leadership coaching. And so don't skip that step. It can be something as simple as how are things going kind of conversation. I mean, you're not reopening the investigation. You just want to make sure things are rolling along great. And I see we only have 4 minutes left, but I do want to show this last slide. And so thank you. I really want to drive home that it doesn't matter what size organization you have or how many employees you have. So the EEOC actually has a press release page. I just kind of went through some recent ones in 2025. And the first one was a pet chain, store chain. It only had 2 stores. It was small and locally owned. It had circled around sexual harassment. The employer denied any wrongdoing. However, in the EEOC claim, they did agree to settle for $340,000. The second one was a very small rural type business, and theirs was in 333. Their fine was 334,500. So you see that visual number, but there's a lot of additional costs should any kind of work claims rise to the level of the state civil right division or the EEOC. I mean, besides the legal fees, there's all kinds of consequences. I mean, all kinds of consequences. And we actually are aware of one case where somebody had to do for 5 years multiple trainings, revise policies. So there is a big financial and operational impact. So I know we only have 2 minutes left. I'm sorry. I know you guys probably have a ton of questions, and I promise we'll reach out to you on those. And I just want to make sure I could get as much information in as possible. So I really appreciate your time. I'm going to let, again, my email address is Becky, Becky, at jerhrgroup.com. And we really, really appreciate your time. So, Cynthia, do you have any comments and any
Well, I just
feedback?
think it was outstanding, Becky. I just want to say thank you because you answered so many questions, and we still have folks with questions over here in the chat box. So I assume you'll follow up with those afterwards.
Yes, I sure
Yeah.
will.
So if you had a question out there, don't worry, they will get to you. And you will be receiving the PowerPoint presentation. And be sure to stay online and take our short little 5-minute interview at the end and let us know how you like today's presentation. And there'll be another PowerPoint presentation, a webinar coming up next month. So please stay tuned to your email and we'll be sending you an invitation to that as well. Well, thank you all for joining us today for another wonderful webinar. And we really appreciate JER HR Group. And anytime you can go to their webinars, I highly recommend them. They're always great. And we got all these hearts and thumbs up floating, so I know everybody enjoyed it. So thanks so much and stay tuned for that short survey. Goodbye, everyone.